The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has called for African nations to unite and stand its ground to prevent being exploited for its rock, soil and dust. This after U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio praised imperial...
At first, it looked like another summit, another speech, another carefully worded warning about colonialism, but something in the tone was different. Why are global powers suddenly scrambling for African minerals like they've discovered treasure maps? Why does the green energy revolution somehow begin in African soil but end in foreign factories? Why did comments about anti-colonial movements spark such a sharp reaction among young Africans? And why are leaders now speaking less about aid and more about leverage? Let's find out. Africa was never poor. It was priced low. That distinction changes everything. For decades, the narrative said the continent lacked capital, lacked technology, lacked discipline. But the soil beneath that narrative told a different story. Cobalt deposits in Central Africa quietly powered the smartphone era. Platinum from Southern Africa stabilized global automotive systems. Uranium from the Sahel fueled electricity grids thousands of kilometers away. Gold, manganese, and lithium are all feed industries that define modern life. So here's the uncomfortable question. If Africa has been powering the world for over a century, why does it still negotiate like a borrower instead of a supplier? The answer is structure. The old model was simple: extract raw minerals, export them, allow refinement, manufacturing, branding, and patent ownership to happen elsewhere. Re-import finished goods at premium prices. The wealth multiplier, the real margin, lived outside the continent. It was efficient, just not for Africans. When leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa talk about exporting rock, soil, and dust, it is not poetry. It is a diagnosis. A continent that sells raw inputs but buys finished innovation is locked at the bottom of the value chain. And value chains are where power hides. Gen Z Africans understand value chains instinctively. They've watched how supply chains collapsed during global crises. They saw how a single shipping disruption sent markets into chaos. They understand that whoever controls processing, logistics, and standards controls leverage. And right now, the global energy transition is rewriting those chains. Electric vehicles depend on lithium and cobalt. Hydrogen technologies depend on platinum group metals. Renewable grids rely on rare earths. The future is mineral intensive, and those minerals are heavily concentrated in Africa. That realization has triggered a shift in mindset. If the world cannot decarbonize without African inputs, then Africa is not peripheral to the transition. It is central. Central actors do not beg, they negotiate. But negotiation requires coordination. For too long, mineral deals were signed state by state, often under pressure, often in competition with neighbors. Fragmentation diluted bargaining power. Buyers benefited from the division. That fragmentation is now being questioned. Continental integration efforts, regional trade alignment, and shared beneficiation strategies are not ideological gestures. They are attempts to correct a pricing error, the underpricing of African leverage. Because here is the truth no one says out loud. Africa is not underdeveloped because it lacks resources. It is underleveraged because it has historically exported them before the transformation. The day Africa internalizes that difference is the day it stops seeing itself as dependent and starts seeing itself as indispensable. And once a continent recognizes its indispensability, the next question becomes unavoidable. If we are indispensable to the future, why are we still negotiating with the mindset of the past? Because the mindset of the past was built on survival. The mindset of the present is built on leverage. There's a difference between knowing you have resources and understanding that the world cannot function without them. For years, Africa was told its minerals were valuable. That sounded flattering, but vague. Valuable for whom? On whose terms? In which part of the chain? Now the conversation is sharper. Cobalt is not just a mineral, it is battery stability. Lithium is not just an ore, it is electric mobility. Platinum is not just a metal, it is a hydrogen infrastructure. When the global north speaks about net zero targets, supply chain security, and green industrial policy, it is indirectly speaking about Africa. And this is where leverage becomes real. Leverage is not shouting at global powers. It is calmly recognizing that your signature matters more than you were led to believe. It is understood that when multiple industrialized economies compete for access to the same resource base, the supplier gains negotiating power if it uses it correctly. That "if" is everything. For decades, competition among buyers did not automatically translate into an advantage for Africa because the negotiations were isolated. Countries competed against each other for foreign investment. Tax holidays were extended. Royalty rates were minimized. Environmental conditions were softened. The race to attract capital sometimes undercut long-term structural gain. But something has shifted. Younger policymakers, economists, and activists are asking different questions. They are less impressed by headline investment figures and more interested in downstream integration. They want refining capacity tied to extraction licenses. They want joint ventures that include equity participation. They want training programs written into agreements. They want timelines for local processing. They are not anti-investment. They are anti-one-sided architecture. When Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about acting collectively and using Africa's leverage without being arrogant, he was describing a strategic posture. Calm, coordinated, firm. Because leverage misused becomes backlash. Leverage coordinated becomes policy. The African Continental Free Trade Area quietly amplifies this. A fragmented continent negotiates in pieces. An integrated market negotiates on scale. A processing facility in one country can serve regional demand without tariff barriers. A standards regime adopted across multiple states prevents regulatory shopping by corporations seeking the weakest link. Scale changes behavior. Global corporations think long-term when they see consistency. Investors plan differently when they see regional stability. Buyers adjust pricing models when they see unified supply strategies. And here is the psychological breakthrough. Africa does not need to threaten anyone to exercise leverage. It only needs to recognize necessity. If electric vehicle production depends on a steady cobalt supply, disruptions hurt manufacturers more than suppliers in the short term. If hydrogen strategies depend on platinum, long-term contracts become strategic partnerships, not charity projects. The moment leverage becomes real is the moment Africa stops asking, "Will they invest?" and starts asking, "Under what terms will we permit integration?" That shift in tone changes everything. But tone alone is not transformation, because leverage without structural capacity is fragile. So the next question becomes unavoidable. Can Africa convert leverage into lasting industrial architecture, or will it remain a negotiating advantage on paper? Leverage becomes threatening the moment it stops being theoretical. That's when the language changes. Notice the shift in global rhetoric over the past few years. Suddenly, mineral access is framed as security. Supply chains are described as strategic vulnerabilities. Alliances are justified in the name of stability. What changed? Africa did. The green transition accelerated. Electric vehicle targets tightened. Hydrogen corridors became national priorities. And policymakers in powerful economies began mapping critical mineral dependencies. When those maps were completed, they revealed something uncomfortable. A significant portion of the future runs through African soil. That realization triggered urgency, and urgency exposes anxiety. When U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke critically about anti-colonial movements and Western decline, many African listeners heard something deeper than political commentary. They heard nostalgia for an unchallenged hierarchy, because dominance is easier when suppliers do not coordinate. But once Africa begins aligning policies, insisting on beneficiation, demanding clearer equity structures, and linking mineral deals to domestic processing, the old comfort zone narrows. This is not about villainizing anyone. It is about recognizing patterns. Historically, whenever regions rich in strategic commodities gained stronger bargaining positions, global politics adjusted. Oil-producing states in the 1970s demonstrated how coordination could shift energy markets. Rare earth disputes in Asia revealed how concentrated supply shapes diplomacy. Africa's minerals now occupy a similar position. The difference is demographic energy. This is a young continent, a digitally connected one, a generation that grew up watching trade data in real time and challenging narratives online. They do not internalize the inevitability of subordination. They ask blunt questions. If the world needs African cobalt, why should cobalt-rich nations accept minimal processing? If hydrogen futures depend on platinum, why shouldn't platinum-rich countries develop fuel cell manufacturing capacity? If lithium underpins electric mobility, why can't lithium producers move into cathode or battery assembly segments? These are not radical demands. They are logical progressions. The nervousness emerges because logic disrupts inertia. When Africa's role was limited to extraction, supply chains were predictable. When Africa signals upward movement within those chains, predictability weakens, and unpredictability unsettles established centers of power. But here is the crucial detail. Africa does not need confrontation to reposition. It needs consistency. Consistency in policy. Consistency in regional coordination. Consistency in linking mineral contracts to industrial development. Once that consistency becomes standard, rhetoric about dominance becomes less relevant. Because dominance in a multipolar, resource-constrained world is harder to sustain when suppliers negotiate collectively. The real tension, then, is not ideological. It is structural. The world is adjusting to the possibility that Africa may no longer accept a permanent place at the bottom of the value chain. And once that possibility becomes real, a deeper question emerges. If external discomfort is rising, does Africa have the internal discipline to sustain this shift? Or will fragmentation reopen the old door? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Fragmentation is not imposed from outside. It grows from inside. That is the uncomfortable truth. For decades, Africa's greatest vulnerability was not a lack of resources. It was misalignment. Competing tax incentives, uncoordinated licensing systems, short-term political calculations override long-term industrial strategy. When one country tightened mineral conditions, another loosened them. Buyers understood this. They played the gaps. Leverage evaporates when unity dissolves. This is where discipline becomes decisive. Discipline means resisting the temptation of quick capital inflows that undermine structural gain. It means refusing contracts that offer headline investment without downstream integration. It means aligning national interest with continental strategy, even when domestic politics are noisy. That is not easy. Look at the Sahel again. Ibrahim Traoré became a symbol because he represented rupture, a break from inherited security and economic arrangements that many felt were stagnant. But rupture is only the first stage. What follows determines legacy. Symbolism can awaken a generation. Only discipline can build infrastructure. Across Africa, the younger generation is watching whether bold rhetoric converts into factories, training institutes, power grids, and transparent mineral frameworks. They do not want theatrical sovereignty. They want measurable sovereignty, measured in megawatts of domestic processing power, measured in the percentage of minerals refined locally, measured in equity stakes retained, measured in patents filed by African engineers. Discipline also requires governance reform. Corruption weakens leverage faster than foreign pressure ever could. If mineral wealth leaks through opaque contracts or elite capture, the structural shift collapses from within. This is where leadership matters. When Cyril Ramaphosa speaks about acting without arrogance, he is acknowledging the tightrope. Africa must assert its position without isolating itself. It must negotiate firmly without destabilizing investor confidence. It must coordinate regionally without sacrificing national accountability. That balance requires institutional maturity. Continental frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Area provide a platform, but platforms do not enforce themselves. States must align custom systems, standardize regulations, invest in cross-border infrastructure, and share data transparently. Discipline is slow. It does not trend on social media, but it determines whether leverage becomes transformation or fades into another cycle of disappointment. Here is the bigger risk. Global powers are patient. If Africa hesitates, delays, or fractures, buyers will diversify supply. New extraction zones will be developed elsewhere. Substitutes will be researched. Recycling technologies will expand. Leverage has a window. Windows close. That is why discipline is not optional. If Africa wants to convert strategic minerals into strategic power, it must synchronize policy, enforce standards, protect transparency, and prioritize industrial capacity relentlessly. Otherwise, fragmentation will quietly reopen the old model. And if discipline holds, what does success actually look like beyond speeches and summits? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Success does not look like applause at a summit. It looks like a refinery humming at full capacity on African soil. It looks like metallurgical engineers are trained locally, not flown in temporarily. It looks like industrial zones are connected to reliable power grids. It looks like rail corridors are designed not just to move ore to ports, but to move processed materials to regional markets. Success is measurable. Start with beneficiation. If lithium leaves as processed battery-grade material instead of raw concentrate, export revenue multiplies. If platinum is converted into fuel cell components domestically, the continent captures technological layers instead of just geological ones. If cobalt is refined regionally, African firms enter higher-value segments of the electric vehicle supply chain. Each additional layer retained internally builds industrial muscle. Then comes employment depth. Mining creates jobs, but processing creates ecosystems. Chemical engineers, technicians, quality control specialists, logistics coordinators, research scientists, and entire networks emerge around downstream capacity. That ecosystem changes cities. It shifts educational priorities. Universities align programs with industrial demand. Vocational institutes modernize. Success looks like young Africans choosing engineering because opportunities exist at home. It also looks like contracts have been rewritten. Instead of pure extraction licenses, agreements tie mineral access to infrastructure development. Rail lines are co-financed. Processing facilities are co-owned. Technology transfer clauses are mandatory. Equity stakes are negotiated rather than assumed away. This is not anti-investor. It is pro-balance. Global companies still profit, but value is shared in structured ways that build long-term capacity. Investors prefer predictability. Predictability increases when Africa's terms are clear, coordinated, and enforced consistently. Success also requires macroeconomic resilience. Debt frameworks must align with industrial strategy. If mineral revenues are collateralized irresponsibly, fiscal vulnerability undermines transformation. If sovereign wealth funds reinvest in downstream industries, instead of parking capital exclusively abroad, domestic leverage strengthens. Stability plays its role here too. Peace in conflict-prone regions strengthens investor confidence and internal supply chains. When African institutions handle peace processes effectively, it signals governance capacity, a critical factor in long-term industrial commitments. And then there is perception. For generations, Africa was framed as a resource base. Success changes the frame. When battery components stamped "Made in Africa" enter global markets, perception shifts. When hydrogen systems incorporate African-designed fuel cell stacks, credibility expands. When mineral-rich states negotiate as equals, not supplicants, geopolitical tone adjusts. This is not about symbolism. It is about repositioning in the hierarchy of production. The continent moves from being the starting point of global supply chains to becoming an integral node within them. But here is the final layer. Success is not just about capturing more value. It is about redefining the mindset permanently. Once a continent experiences negotiating from strength, once it sees tangible results from coordinated leverage, it does not revert easily to passive roles. So if success becomes visible in factories, contracts, and trade balances, the deeper question emerges. When Africa finally negotiates as indispensable, how does the global order adjust to a continent that no longer sees itself as peripheral? When Africa negotiates as indispensable, the world does not collapse. It recalibrates. Global systems are pragmatic. They respond to incentives. If Africa insists on beneficiation before export, investors calculate processing costs locally instead of abroad. If continental standards align, Corporations restructure compliance strategies. If mineral contracts require equity participation, financial models adapt. The adjustment will not be dramatic. It will be quiet. Supply chains will shift routes. Joint ventures will increase. Training programs will expand. Long-term offtake agreements will include clauses once considered optional. The world does not resist necessity forever. It negotiates with it. But adjustment also reshapes diplomacy. For decades, many African states entered global forums from a defensive position. Debt negotiations, aid discussions, and structural conditions. As mineral leverage strengthens and industrial capacity expands, the tone changes. Conversations move from relief to partnership, from vulnerability to co-design. This does not eliminate global inequality overnight. It changes posture. A continent that refines its minerals, integrates its markets, stabilizes its conflict zones, and coordinates policy speaks differently in global institutions. Its vote carries economic weight, not just moral appeal. That is when geopolitical psychology shifts. Because global power has always been rooted in production capacity. Nations that control manufacturing shape trade norms. Regions that control strategic inputs shape security discussions. Those who occupy both spaces influence rulemaking. Africa historically occupied one space, resource provision. If it succeeds in occupying both resource provision and industrial transformation, its influence multiplies. But here is the reality. Adjustment is not passive. External actors will diversify supply where possible. Recycling technologies will expand. Substitutes will be researched. Alternative mining zones will be developed. Leverage creates countermoves. This is why internal coordination remains essential. A single fragmented policy reversal can weaken continental credibility. A sudden regulatory inconsistency can undermine years of negotiation gains. Sustained discipline ensures that adjustment remains favorable. And then comes the generational shift. Gen Z Africa is not emotionally attached to old hierarchies. They are not intimidated by global institutions. They grew up in a multipolar information environment. They see power as fluid. If factories rise, if contracts reflect equity, if industrial ecosystems deepen, that generation internalizes something powerful. Sovereignty is practical, not abstract. Practical sovereignty means jobs linked to value chains. It means export statistics reflecting processed goods. It means fiscal independence reinforced by retained margins. And once that mindset solidifies, reversal becomes difficult. The world will adjust to a continent that no longer exports potential, but exports capacity. It will negotiate with a bloc that understands timing, scale, and coordination. It will respect suppliers who act like architects. The refinery lights before sunrise will not just symbolize industry, they will symbolize permanence. And when permanence replaces dependency, the final transformation occurs. Africa stops asking where it fits in the global order. It begins shaping it. Let us know in the comments section, should Africa start calling out West often? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.